Good morning. Welcome. My name is Jason Jedlinski. I am General Manager and Publisher of The Hill. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here this morning to our program on housing and rental markets and accessibility, affordability, and equity in the year ahead. First, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Wells Fargo, for their support of today's event. And this morning, we're going to be exploring the current landscape of housing in America, how ballooning interest rates and rent costs are impacting American families. We'll also take a look at what we can expect in the year ahead, especially during this time of inflation and increased housing demand. We'll be joined by several leaders from Capitol Hill and an exciting lineup of housing experts and economists. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. In addition to our audience here in the room, we're also live streaming this event on thehill.com and YouTube, so please keep your phones on silent for the duration of the program. We encourage you to join the conversation on social media. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at The Hill Events, and we'll be using the hashtag #TheHillHousing. It is my pleasure to welcome our first guest this morning, Congressman French Hill, Ranking Member of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance. Welcome, Congressman Hill. So I have some brief introductory notes, and I thought, given your expertise working in the Bush senior administration in finance and economic policy, you've been a commercial banker and investment manager, executive secretary to the President's Economic Policy Council. With that kind of background, help us frame the conversation that we're going to be having for the next couple hours. We see inflation affecting the cost of everything right now, not just housing. And we're also seeing a hot housing market that's become unattainable for many Americans. How did we get here? Can you help rewind and put the pieces together?
Well, we don't want to belabor it, but it's certainly driving a lot of the concerns that we have with housing. If you think about accessibility to housing, affordability of housing, constraints on supply, all those are connected with what we're experiencing in the economy. And it's been compounded by the war in Ukraine. It's been compounded by the pandemic. But this underlying inflation, I think, comes from two principal sources. One, we've forgotten that consensus that we had in this country that large deficits are bad and that too much borrowing is bad. And I think both political parties have had that for decades. Not very good at balancing the budget, but periodically getting close, there's that consensus. And in the pandemic unleashed this just money spending madness. We spend about $4.5 trillion every year to run the government. We approved $5 trillion in spending to try to fight the pandemic. And since President Biden's been in office, he's authorized and appropriated another $5 trillion on top of that annualized spending. So we have too many dollars chasing too few goods, classic definition. This happened in the 60s and 70s as well. Secondly, when we went into the pandemic, the Federal Reserve, and I was on the CARES Act Oversight Commission, working routinely with Secretary Mnuchin and Jay Powell, trying to structure and oversee those programs at the Fed to get us out of the ditch of the pandemic. But we had a fundamental flaw, I think, both that we talked about then and in hindsight with the benefit of more color on what's happened. You have a 9% output decline, 21% unemployment, a sharp decline because were we in an economic crisis? No. We were in a public health crisis that then the government agreed to shut the economy down. Then that's very different because the concept would be, well, then if the public health crisis ends, then the government would lift those and people would go back to work. And in fact, that is what happened. We found that we were going to have a vaccine, that we were going to put our kids back in school. And in August of 2020, 80% of Arkansas kids were back in school. People were back at work, maybe not in the Beltway, but they were out across the country. And so you did have a V-shaped recovery for incomes and employment. That's the point. And we had a stimulus of that fiscal stimulus and the actions of the Federal Reserve that were almost a third of GDP. So fiscal policy and monetary policy were too luxuriant, too accommodative, and that continues. And that is the underlying reason for inflation, but made worse by supply chain disruption,
right,
No question about that. And no one is sugarcoating that. And you see that in housing par excellence. We're a big lumber producing state in Arkansas. And we saw those mills shut down by the public health crisis. And it was very hard to get those mills back open and back up to production. And you saw that springtime 2020 spike in lumber prices. And because all that demand money we just talked about, what did people go do? They took that savings and they went out and bought a new house. Or they saw that they could get their big salary but not have to live in the urban area, and they could move. And so you had this huge housing demand at the exact moment that we had supply constraints. So
it is a perfect storm in many ways.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm.
And given the Inflation Reduction Act, what are you expecting both in Arkansas and beyond as a result of that?
Well, I don't know that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to live up to its name. But I do think that if we want to get inflation under control, we should go back to pre-pandemic spending debates, go back to fighting with each other in the political parties to get to a balanced budget, close as possible, stop burdening our future generations with enormous debt. We should unleash all of the above American energy to bring down energy prices, help our allies abroad. We should not add burdensome regulation to the economy that's trying to keep people employed, and we should not, raise taxes on manufacturers and producers.
In the late 80s, early 90s, I know you were instrumental in historic negotiations in Japan and sort of post-Berlin War funding and economic policy in Europe. Anything you take from those experiences that could be applied domestically at this moment in time?
Well, I think we've seen a real challenge between the United States and Europe, Japan with trade policies in China. And they were very reminiscent of how Americans felt about Japan in the late 1980s. They loved the Japanese, but the Japanese had very strong constraints to keep American products out of Japan. And the trade environment in Japan and the United States was all about breaking down those barriers. And what's happened now in China is we've failed to break down those barriers in China, and China has become an economic, diplomatic, military rival to the U.S. and Europe, and so it's really making that trade environment very challenging. But I'll say this, I spent many years in Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall fell, and I want to reiterate America's partnership with Europe to eject Putin out of Ukraine. And that's a challenge. It's a fiscal challenge. It's a leadership challenge. It's a diplomatic challenge. But based on my experience of being in Europe, working on behalf of President Bush in 1992 and 1993 following the wall, or 91 and 92 following the wall's collapse in 89, you see modern Europe today, and people want to go backwards to, Peter the Great. I mean, this is nuts.
Yeah.
And so we need to make sure that Europe is allowed to be the democratic Western society that it wants to be.
Coming back home around housing, I know you've sponsored and introduced legislation to modernize community development block grant funding. What role do you expect that to have with HUD in terms of improving access and equity to affordable housing?
The Cdbg program was the aggregation of all the Nixon Ford programs rolled into a block grant for cities to use. It was meant to be flexible. President Reagan in the early 80s reiterated that we like the block grant approach. We don't like where government goes in and builds public infrastructure like they did with the Urban Development Action Grant, UDAG, which the Reagan administration abolished, where we were going and buying building parking decks for wealthy ball teams and things like that. So CDBG is to be driven locally and to have that flexibility. But I'd like to look at the formula. 50% of the triggering in formula for an entitlement city is what was your pre-1940 housing stock? Okay, well, that's a pretty outdated definition, and it might be great for Cleveland, who had 1 million more people in Cleveland in 1936, 1940 than they do today. But what about Dallas, Los Angeles, Houston, the growth of America? Do you really want entitlement cities to have 50% of the definition of CDBG to be based on what their pre-1940 housing stock was. So I think we ought to look at modernizing that definition. We ought to consider the 27 approved uses for CDBG. To the staff here, it may not sound very controversial. Sounds very common sense what I just say, but you are tinkering with, an entitlement program that mayors count on.
What are some of the factors you would substitute for that 50% that's currently?
I don't know. I think we should have hearings on it. We've never even reauthorized that program. The last time we had a serious hearing on CDBG was, I think, 2005, 2006. So Congress ought to hold hearings on this, ought to get the views of mayors, get the views of county officials in rural states that don't have an entitlement city based on population, and we ought to look at it and see if we can't find a consensus on modernizing it.
On a related note, you recently signed a letter to the Federal Housing Finance Agency seeking more oversight for Fannie and Freddie. Tell us about that.
So one of the big undone challenges, I think, facing American housing finance is the fact that after the financial crisis, we put Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, our two big secondary mortgage market organizations, in conservatorship. They're actually run by the federal government. It's like akin to a failed company that's not in bankruptcy, but it's not in reorganization. It's just in purgatory, to use a good Catholic phrase. And here it is, it's 12 years later, Jason, and we've made no change. So I've been in Congress, it'll be 8 years at the end of the year. We've tried to find, both in the Obama administration through Secretary Lew and in the Trump administration through Secretary Mnuchin, an ability to try to come together and change direction. And we have not had that, and we've had no such direction from the Biden administration. And I say this because, sure, Congress can get together and work on it, but if you don't have a partner in the administration with the stick of the executive branch to say, we're going to fix Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and find consensus, you're really whistling past the graveyard on that project.
So are you recommending an end to the conservatorship or just a more active management of Fannie and Freddie?
I would be thrilled to have a plan for resolution of the conservatorship. And my views might not be shared with Senator Brown, but we ought to have that debate. And we had it in I'd say when the Republicans controlled the House, we had the debate. We didn't make much progress, but we had Democratic support. Jim Himes, now Governor Carney of Delaware, all working in the House. And then Senator Corker was very interested when he was in the Senate, and we've just lost that momentum. We need to find a way to have that conversation.
We talked about the block grants and Fannie and Freddie. I wonder whether HUD more broadly, what would the one or two most impactful things you think this administration could do at the HUD level to improve this perfect storm, as we said, between supply chain and interest rates and access to housing?
Well, people want two comments. One, I want to talk about Section 8, and then let's talk about public housing, and then thirdly, let's talk about housing affordability. On Section 8, I was a staffer on the Senate Housing Subcommittee in 1983 when the Section 8 program was envisioned and rolled out by HUD in the early Reagan administration. And the idea was, look, this is a way for someone to seek a better home in a better neighborhood, near a better school, near a job, and give flexibility and have it be essentially a blind benefit. It wasn't meant to find entire apartment complexes that are only voucher apartment complexes. That was never the intent of this program.
Was it a foreseen consequence?
I don't think so. No, because the idea was if you pay a market rent, let that person seeking a better life leave the city, go to the county, leave the city, go to another city, go to another neighborhood within the city, have that portability, have them in charge. And what I've seen is over the past 40 years, effectively, HUD doesn't pay a market rent. So the program is less effective. So what happens is we are now congregating voucher users into low-income apartment complexes, the exact opposite of what the mission of that program was. And then you find some people advocating for project-based vouchers, which I'm not against, but that wasn't really the intent of the program either, and those can be quite effective. But I think that reform there, if you said, what's the best reform, I would say, relook at the formula that says how HUD pays a market rent.
So it's
And
really,
I think you'll find more landlords then would find that a more appealing program. It's not about paying a security deposit or that the inspections drag their feet in HUD in inspecting the project. That contributes to it because that's big government dragging its feet, being bureaucratic about not approving whether this apartment complies with HUD rules or not. I think it, show me the money. I'm going to tell you, paying a market, having a more effective way to demonstrate you're paying a market rent would be the most powerful change on that one.
so it sounds like the funding, especially as expressed in those rent allotments, you put the bulk of the blame, if you will, for what's happened with the program on that. I expect community perceptions, et cetera, have contributed to where that's ended up.
There is no one answer there. I'm simply saying that if I were doing a weighted average on what contributes to fewer landlords, fewer entrepreneurial landlords participating, I think you'll find that paying that fair market rent in any given metro area is an issue. Housing affordability. Look, you can't federalize a solution to that. It's like coming to me and saying, hey, I don't like my police force. Why don't you do something about it? I said, well, why don't you do something about it? You have a city council, you have a quorum court, you have a mayor, you have a local political infrastructure. Why don't you reform your police department? It's not up to the federal government to do that. Likewise, when you say, oh, I can't build affordable housing in my community, why don't you look at all the things that might break down to doing that? I'm so pleased to live in a beautiful place like Little Rock, Arkansas, where a teacher or a first responder making $40,000 can buy a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house with a fenced backyard and be 20 minutes from work. I mean, I'm blessed with that situation. Not everybody else is, and I respect that. But let's break down the things locally before we start trying to have the federal government preempt and solve a problem that is really the origin of that problem is right there in that metro area. And then on public housing, I think the RAD program, which allows public housing to take the 1939 public housing units that are scattered over the country and replace those unit for unit, has been pretty successful. I think I hear from public housing officials, from tenants, from others that that's been a positive. But, are they mixing the units with today's society in an effective way? Is there space to do workforce training or access to Wi-Fi or school homework or after-school activities at that community area? I've been to San Bernardino, and I'd say the answer is 100% yes in those RAD projects out in California. In the RAD projects in my towns of Little Rock and North Little Rock, Arkansas, I would say no. Very modest, what I call community space. So we have some work we could do there.
What can we learn and improve on from the, call it the last 6-7 decades of public housing in the United States? I mean, you talk about local control, city councils, mayors, yet there's a well-documented history that it's not just de facto segregation, but it's been policy-driven segregation along racial lines and otherwise that's enforced and hardened some of the divisions in communities across America.
So this is why I'm not opposed to RAD in public housing, but are you really solving a problem there? No, you're still continuing to localize it, if you will. Leave it in the same geography, leave it in that same process, which is why in the, going 4 decades, I supported the Voucher program, which gives individual freedom to individual families to try to better themselves. A low, moderate income family takes the part of that voucher that contributes into their monthly income and goes and finds a better situation. But we've, as I say, concentrated that program. That's a prime example of what you're talking about, where you're not offering, I think, a flexible equity, upward mobility type solution. So
I guess I'm wondering if that's where guidelines or parameters from the federal perspective would help ensure a more equitable.
Well, I mean, but then you say, the RAD program concentrates public housing tenants back in that same public housing location from a period in time that you're stipulating, I would say, that it was built there for racist purposes, right? So are you changing the dynamic? I don't think so. I mean, the Sergeant Shriver and the Lyndon Johnson program did more to segregate and create inequity in this society than anybody ever gives them credit for, because we think about Medicaid and Medicare as freeing positive social programs. But urban renewal is what people are railing against now, and that was a principal mission of the Johnson administration. So why don't we take RAD dollars and instead of doing those, why don't you tear down the public housing and let that property be redeveloped and let it go to a higher and better use, and maybe that money goes back in a revolving loan fund for HUD to build new housing, and take those dollars and put it in a true voucher program that lets people move around in a community and not be concentrated in a concentrated low-income neighborhood. I mean, but you can't do that if you just want to rinse and repeat, do the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, I hear the vision. I appreciate the need for a pivot from what policy has looked like. How do we do that at this moment, given the inflation and supply chain and other crises? I saw a statistic that I think for a $400,000 home, the mortgage on January 1st versus September 1st this year, $700 more a month for a family trying to buy a $400,000 home. Their mortgage payment goes up by $9,000 a year compared to where it was in January. What constraints does that put on the growth?
It's a huge constraint. It's why the inflation caused by the mistakes of this administration, contributed by the pandemic, I certainly will acknowledge that, have given this point. But we have to think through policy long run on what would be the best housing and community development policy. Bad economy, good economy, in and out. So any decision that we take is not going to resolve that mortgage disparity brought about by bad economic policies by the Federal Reserve and the federal government. So, to send your complaint, you send it to, Constitution Avenue, to the Fed and to the OMB and the White House. But what can we do? Look at all the benefits our states, when it comes to higher interest rates on the mortgage side, more people will need first-time home buyer assistance potentially. They'll need a bigger down payment, right? In my state, we have ample first-time home buyer down payment money. We use the bond program, and we constantly we have a surplus every year of trying to help people get that first-time home buyer assistance. But don't forget, we're also benefited by those lower costs I talked about initially. But you're not going to, in the short run, be able to hide from higher mortgage prices. And you'll see the market determine flexibility. When I bought my first house in the middle of the 1980s, in the highest inflation before this time, I had a famous thing called an adjustable rate mortgage. That was not a bad one, not evil, like they got their reputation in the 2005 crisis. And you saw headlines this last week. More and more people are going back to an ARM because they're making an intermediate decision. I'm doing household formation. We want to get married. We want to buy a home. With home buyer assistance and an ARM, we bridge the gap of this short-term crisis that we're in of inflation. And so there will be market reaction there, and people will have to be flexible. And I was glad to have that ARM. It allowed me to buy a home. I'd never owned one before. I'd been out of college, I guess, 10 years or something like that, close to it. I was getting ready to get married. And I paid something in the mid-1980s in the threes, but it had a maximum cap of 7 in those days. But I knew I wouldn't be in the house that long. You've got to make that kind of financial decision.
So in the short term, on the supply side, even with the ARM, with first-time home buyer assistance, home construction has been disrupted by the supply chain. You mentioned the lumber coming out of Arkansas.
Right.
What are you recommending, or what would you imagine would help from that standpoint of just creating more inventory for people to use ARMs and that home buyer assistance for?
Well, we're definitely, several million units short, and we were before we got into this crisis. We were short housing units for housing formation across the country. And we're a very mobile society, and so sometimes you get those dislocations. So again, what are the barriers to why people are not building more units in any metro area? And so that's why there's not one federal solution. We have federal dollars to try to help on the low moderate income side through HUD, through CDBG, and through state housing programs and through city housing programs. But again, if you want lower home construction costs, don't pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Don't pass American Rescue. Don't pass Inflation Reduction, because every one of those bills is driving up the cost of labor and materials. And you talk to people institutionally who are going to try to take advantage of some of the bipartisan infrastructure bills. They can't find labor. And now I actually had the highway department in my state come to me and say, well, we're glad to have the infrastructure bill, but now we won't be able to build what we planned on building because of inflation. I said, this is circular logic. We're creating this problem by the way we are passing all this money and trying to do it all in this short period of time. So we are our own worst enemy, I would say, on trying to lower housing construction costs. But they will come down, and in the meantime, cities and counties ought to be looking at ways to get out of the way, lower regulatory costs, increase policies that would make land to be entitled for single-family housing and multifamily housing more affordable.
I know we wanted to talk not just about housing, but also about the rental market. Rents are sky high. We see that in the headlines every day. According to HUD, the number of individuals with chronic patterns of homelessness went up 20% during the first to the second year of the pandemic. So you can imagine, as you said, this cycle, right? People are not able to get housed and have that stability. They're not able to then work for the Arkansas Highway Department and use that money. What are some of the things that you'd like to see happen in terms of more affordable rental housing?
Well, it gets back to that construction cost first and foremost. And, we have land entitlement costs to build multifamily is the number one issue about whether or not it's going to be affordable. So those land zoning rules, paying those development fees up front, the NIMBY issue of we don't want multifamily in our neighborhood, all that drives up rental housing costs. And during the pandemic, we tried to offset that with rental assistance, with the income assistance, with the Paycheck Protection Program. All that was putting money in people's pockets to try to maintain access to housing through rent, by being able to pay rent or make their mortgage payment. And those programs continue, and they're not even connected to the pandemic. We now, in the American Rescue Plan, pay your rent even if you don't have a burden from the pandemic, and we make a mortgage payment even if you don't have a burden from the pandemic. You just self-certify that you need help paying your mortgage, and Uncle Sam pays that through the states. So I hate to keep going back like I'm a broken record about the number one issue that causes rental housing costs to go up, and they're up dramatically. And so is single family prices. All that is connected to this spurt of inflation, and as inflation comes down, you'll see rents come down, you'll see those home prices come down, particularly in markets where you can't even connect the supply-demand increase, where you have 20, 30% price increases in some markets on housing over the last 2 years. And there's no underlying economic reason other than people with money who are seeking to, shift cities from the pandemic.
So we've talked about Fannie and Freddie and HUD and what you'd like to see from the administration. What advice near term would you give a constituent who is in a place like you, were 10 years out of college, trying to get their first home or trying to move into a city and take a higher paying job and find housing? What can home buyers and renters practically do until some of those reforms come about?
Well, for low moderate income families trying to obtain assistance to help resolve a rental issue, again, they have the ability to take advantage of some of these rental programs that are still out there. And we, again, for a low moderate income family that wants first-time home buyer assistance, I think there are robust plans to do that, including very effective FHA programs that are lower cost for first-time home buyers, for first responders, for people at moderate incomes with kids. So that's my advice there. And for someone who's buying a traditional home, I'd look at, depending on their income, home buyer assistance combined with an ARM might be a way to help a family in trying to buy their first house in a more expensive market. So those are certainly some ideas.
I appreciate the dialogue and want to open it up to questions, whether we have those from social media using the hashtag #TheHillHousing or here in the room on Capitol Hill. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks,
I
Jason.
appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Appreciate it.
I'd like to welcome on the stage for our sponsor perspective, Patrice Willoughby, Vice President of Policy and Legislative Affairs Strategy for the NAACP, and Gigi Dixon, Executive Vice President and Head of External Engagement for Diverse Segments, Representation, and Inclusion at Wells Fargo for the sponsor perspective presented by Wells Fargo. Welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm honored to be here. I'm Gigi Dixon, Head of External Engagement for Wells Fargo, and honored to be here on behalf of my company to have this critical conversation. Housing, equity, and affordability, which is a major pillar of our Wells Fargo work to address the financial wealth gap. And this year we focused on a range of opportunities around housing affordability. We've announced a special purpose credit program initially focused on helping Black homeowners whose mortgages are currently serviced by Wells Fargo to refinance with below current market rates. The program kicked off in June, and with the Federal Housing Authority, we've serviced by Wells Fargo, expanded to Veterans Affairs loans with plans to include government-sponsored enterprise loans in the fourth quarter. We have a Dream Plan Home affordable mortgage program also, and it's helped more than 10,000 families purchase homes and assist with closing costs since its inception in 2020. So today I'm really proud to be here with you, Patrice Willoughby, with over 20 years of service to the U.S. House of Representatives executive branch and in the private sector. Patrice has applied racial equity to advancing financial services, tax, and technology. Patrice has served as Chief of Staff and Counsel to the late Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones in Ohio, District 11. You've guided legislation to enhance retirement security and expand SBA lending programs, and you later served as Executive Director of the Congressional Black Caucus supporting the passage of the Recovery Act, Dodd-Frank Financial Reform, and the Affordable Care Act. And today, Patrice, you are the Vice President of Policy and Legislative Affairs Strategy for the NAACP. Welcome, Patrice.
Thank you.
So NAACP has had a long and proud history of addressing racial inequities and injustice and opening opportunities for people of color. Just this past July, we, Wells Fargo, participated in a housing panel with you, Patrice, and opening opportunities for Blacks in housing and home ownership. This was the 113th convention of the NAACP, an organization that is 113 years old. And we noticed that housing affordability challenges and lack of home ownership does create a broader economic impact. But Wells Fargo, along with the NAACP and other national partners, agree with the need for economic justice, housing affordability, and home ownership. So let's get into the conversation. So Patrice, what do you see as the biggest inequities in housing, and what is the linkage between racial inequities and home ownership and broader economic standing in the community?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Gigi, and the Hill for inviting me here on behalf of the NAACP. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about an issue which is so important and critical in the racial wealth gap. Home ownership is the #1 predictor of family wealth, and census data indicate that homeowners are 89 times have 89 times more wealth than renters. So if you look at the historic development of the housing market, we know that there have been restrictive covenants and federal programs as well that restricted the ability of African Americans to access home ownership. And currently, Black homeowners and Black renters are more highly burdened with debt than other communities. The rate of Black homeownership is around 44%, whereas for white homeowners it's about 74%. And so we have to look at the housing system holistically. This is one of the reasons why the NAACP has been a very strong proponent of student debt cancellation, because when the debt to income ratio of an applicant for a mortgage is too high, they cannot qualify. And so all of those factors impact the ability of people to access financing, because unless we address, we actually have to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to address affordability, access, as well as break down any other structural barriers.
Yeah. So the NAACP, Patrice, has been a leader in fighting against racial inequities in housing, from working decades ago to remove the FHA exclusion for African American home buyers, to continuing to be a voice for fair housing today. 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, we still see discriminatory practices impacting home and housing opportunities. How can we make progress? And how does the NAACP view its role?
Well, first of all, the Fair Housing Act is such an important piece of legislation, but courts recognize that there is a liability attached to disparate impact in housing policy. And so at the NAACP, we have focused on a number of advocacy strategies, both activism, legislation, and engaging with corporate partners. We have had lots of discussions between the NAACP and Wells Fargo, some of them tough discussions, because we believe that it's important to attack the system on all sides. We have the ability to drill down on data, and it's important to have a racial equity lens on how policies that may appear neutral on their face have a negative impact on communities of color. And we have focused continuously in that area, as well as from the perspective of the federal level. We're aware that other factors may affect discrimination as well, and the ability and access of people to have their homes through, for example, the algorithmic models that value homes, that can create disparity in the property values on which mortgage lenders determine what the interest rate is and will be of the borrower. And so some of those are affirmatively and open policies. Others are hidden, not so much because anyone's hiding them, but because they're unintended, and they're unintended consequences that have to be examined for their impact on communities of color and other communities.
Yes, there's a nice focus, I think, that's happening right now around appraisal bias as you talk about the housing appraisals and housing values. And so it's a very, very important point, the hidden and the overt. Mm-hmm. So with the COVID pandemic, we witnessed an increase in public awareness and concern for the importance of a home to keep people together, healthy, and to reduce the transmission of the virus. Wells Fargo shared this concern, and since the start of the pandemic, we've provided $50 million to legal assistance and housing counseling organizations to help keep nearly 400 people housed. And we've also provided $10 million to the National Center on State Courts to work with justice systems around the country, reducing the impact of evictions that were talked about earlier today, and to make improvements to their processes. So as one of the economic policy leaders in the NAACP, Patrice, what is your suggestion for how public-private partnerships can expedite results for economic equity?
Well, I think, as I said, walking and chewing gum at the same time, very important. If you look at the 2020 HMDA data, for example, there are about 370,000 individuals or transactions that failed to complete because of the need for some type of assistance, either closing costs or down payment assistance. And that's one of a good example of how public-private partnerships can operate to really help individuals who would otherwise qualify or be able to obtain financing for a home. There are other aspects of public-private partnerships, for example, development requirements in some localities in which there are a percentage of units or homes that are set aside for moderate income families, and also intentionality in the way that those partnerships create the incentive for developers to do redevelop property in areas that are near schools and transit, properties that can be developed that have multiple units for families with children, and also that enable people who are moderate income to live closer to city centers as opposed to way out in the suburbs. So localities and government create the incentives, but the private sector has a really important role in providing the pathway for capital to flow to those programs that would enhance home ownership.
Very good. And so housing affordability. Just last week, I had the opportunity to visit Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a good visit. Coming from Charlotte, North Carolina, the weather was really cool, and it felt really good. But what was amazing was Mayor Johnson and County Executive Crowley in Milwaukee launched our Worth Initiative in the market. Wealth Opportunities Restored through Home Ownership. That's what the acronym stands for, which is a program, Patrice, that you're very well aware of. We are providing $60 million in grants to support local collaboratives, and that is all of the different entities in the community coming together in 8 markets to address racial and ethnic home ownership gap. So it was really exciting in Milwaukee because our goal there, of course, is to stop the loss of home ownership. They're losing over 1,000 homes, or 1,000 individuals and families are losing homes a year. And the idea is to flip that to ensure that at least 1,000 homeowners are created per year over the next 4 years, 5,000 homeowners in total over that period of time. And so it's a realization that there's no one strategy to solve this kind of challenge in local markets, and it's been with us for a long time. And so what we'd like to know is, what are some of the strategies the NAACP thinks are important and most impactful when looking to open up more home ownership opportunities for people of color?
Well, as we mentioned public-private partnerships in the last question, I think we also have to look at some of the systems that people engage in when they're trying to obtain housing finance. For example, the use of credit. I have had many conversations within the NAACP and our committees that are throughout the United States, our units and state branches and chapters. And credit and debt are really critical aspects of home ownership. Alternate credit scoring would go a long way because Currently, when payments like utilities and other consistent payments that renters make are not included in a credit score, it has a depressive effect on the ability of individuals to access the credit markets. I also think that there is a huge role in financial education. When we speak with our units and branches, there's a huge hunger for the type of information on economic education, as well as homeownership programs that are offered at the state and local level. And with respect to supply, currently we know that there's been a supply gap of about 100,000 units for many, many years now. And supply, in terms of what municipalities can do, is really critical for individuals in their communities to advocate for the availability of legislation, or the enactment of legislation, I should say, that would reinforce the availability of lower income housing units. In recent years, the single-family residential market has been extremely attractive as a vehicle for private investment. Indeed, about 20% or 74% of the purchases by private equity were single-family homes, and about 20% of those were in the low to moderate income range. And I think that within communities, people are aware that they are priced out of the market because they're not able to access or compete with an investor that comes in and pays full cash price. And so the advocacy that we engage at the NAACP really connects people to the types of legislative ideas that municipalities can really work on, because this is a systemic issue. It's not just housing finance, it's affordability. It is the historic inequity of accumulated debt, and the racial, all of those contribute to the racial wealth gap, where people who are low to moderate income are really trying to access a market which increases year over year, but their finances, their personal finances, have not increased to keep up with it. So that's why I say it's going to take a whole approach, walking and chewing gum at the same time.
Absolutely, and all hands on deck. It was really amazing in the Milwaukee community to see all of those nonprofit entities come together and focus on every aspect of home ownership for those individuals and families that have not had access. They focused on rehab, they focused on empty lots, they focused on investor property, how to pull together a fund so that they could purchase those properties and to ensure that those properties were available to close the gap on the lack of inventory, housing inventory. And so all hands on deck, partnerships, very important, and we greatly appreciate the national partnership and the local community partnerships that we have with the NAACP. Thank you, Patrice.
Thank you, Gigi.
Conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Now, please welcome to the stage Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, Chair of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance. He'll be in conversation with Steve Clemens, contributing editor at The Hill. Congressman Cleaver.
Jason, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here after a long delay on Amtrak coming in. Congressman Cleaver, I was just listening to Gigi and Patrice, and they were sort of laying out some of the harsher realities of today's housing market, whether you're looking at home ownership, you're looking at rentals, you're looking at just housing in general. We have something going on in the economy which is a shortage. A lot of people not able to even have a roof over their head, And I was very impressed with the conversation, and as many programs that we may talk about with trying to sort of assist and provide rental assistance or provide public housing. Talk to Mayor Bowser here in D.C. This is among her highest priorities to look at how we deal with housing that's affordable housing for those who work and reside in this city. I guess my question to you, and I want to get to your origins in a moment in this subject, but how high a priority is this housing dimension right now among your colleagues? I get the sense not high enough.
I think there is some interest, but not at the level that.
But it's not like DEFCON 5.
No. I mean, it's not like anxiousness to play marbles. I mean, it's just not as strong as it should be. When you compare it with the need, there's an imbalance there. And I would argue with anyone that without adequate housing, without decent, affordable housing, there is very little opportunity for an individual to survive psychologically, economically. And so in Congress, we'll put everything ahead of doing what is required. I mean, the whole budget can't handle this, and then we'll fund the Air Force with jets that they tell us they don't want and don't need anymore. But when you start talking about housing, it's a problem.
An insane price per plane, right? So, but I want our audience to understand why this is such a palpable issue for you. You have shared publicly photographs of the home you spent the first 7 years of your life. I have that photograph. I wish I could show it. When we edit this in the future, folks, go look at Congressman Cleaver's own sharing of his home. And when I call it a home, it was a shack. Would you like to tell our audience why this is so deep for you?
Well, it was a shack, and that's describing it elegantly. I was born in a place called Waxahachie, Texas. My house is 26 minutes from the Omni Hotel in downtown Dallas. Last time I was down there speaking, I got up and drove it just to see. And my father had gone to Prairie View A&M University and got a certificate to learn the trade of laundering, and he opened up Cleaver's Cleaners. Well, in Waxahachie, Texas, was a population of about 1,500 African Americans, and only African Americans would come there, and most of the African Americans were, at best, African American middle class. They were poor, and so he couldn't make it. But so he was able to get this shanty that he paid $5 a week for us to live there. My mother, father, 3 sisters, and me. He paid $5 a week, and we had no electricity, no indoor running water, and no windows. My dad had nailed the windows up with wood and tin. The good news is Texas doesn't get cold like Washington. And I don't even remember a cold night in the house, but I'm sure there were very.
I like the line you had there. Something like, you learned that warmth in a family doesn't come from a furnace.
That's right. It does not come from a furnace. It comes from all other places, but not the furnace. And so growing up like that, and we moved out of that into public housing.
Right.
And my father worked like 3 jobs. We'd see him only on Sundays because he's working all the way to midnight every night, so we could move, so he could get out of public housing. That's why I get irritated when I hear people putting down people living in public housing or saying they're lazy, they don't want to work. I think when anybody says that, they are creating their image as one of elegant stupidity.
Right.
And so when I became involved in politics, my goal was to try to reduce the number, if not eliminate, the number of people who lived like we did. I mean, that was not that was not exciting living, nor did it do anything to improve my somebodiness. You know, if anything, it said, you know, you're not worth very much. This house you're living in is not worth very much.
Well, you know, I listened to Patrice a minute ago. If I could just, you know, refer back here, you know, there are some things that came up that reminded me of the former mayor of Alexandria. Was a good guy and was really obsessed with the question of how to get affordable housing. And as a mayor trying to deal with this issue, you don't have a lot of levers. But one of the levers he had, they needed a fire department. They could lay out permits that would allow for multi-use, as you were saying, multi-use homes, build affordable housing into something that had public need, and then found ways that folks could finance it. There's something that, you know, Price Waterhouse got involved with intergenerational financing, which meant between generations, you had intergenerational financing, and various other unique forms of evolution in a way to help people have an on-ramp, either in renting or buying a home. I think that's all fine and good. We see this thing. But what really bothers me from your seat and looking at Congress is the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the Great Recession, wiped out so many new home buyers or home buyers that were underwater. That hit the black community far more substantially than other communities, the Hispanic community next. The white community largely weathered it, and now we see them at all-time rates of home ownership in the white community. Why wasn't there a public policy response to help keep those people in their homes at that time? Because
there was no wheel. I was there. I was in Congress in 2008. I was there the day that Secretary Polson came over at a special meeting of our Committee of Financial Services to tell us that President Bush said that if we did not act before the Asians opened on Monday, we were going to fall into a depression. Because I can remember clearly turning to Dennis Moore, sitting next to me in the committee room, and I said to him, I want to go home. I mean, I didn't sign up for this. And then we watched the decimation of housing for all across the economic spectrum, but for black and brown people, there has not been a recovery. And so without a recovery, there is no way to transfer wealth. Generational wealth comes, you know, from property, which we're you know, in the rears on that. So I think there has to be great intentionality in Congress, and that's what I've been trying to do to get this done. But I mean, we do dumb things. For example, one-for-one replacement of public housing. Right now, the policy of the United States, the richest, the most powerful nation on the planet, we cannot build a new unit in public housing unless a unit is destroyed. I mean, that's like room temperature IQ. It is not healthy for us to have that policy. I was in Louisiana and Mississippi right after Katrina.
Right.
We saw public housing units torn down. We cleaned them out, mopped them, poured some Purex on the floor, and replaced 2. And so people had to move right back in. So it's one-for-one. Remember that one-for-one replacement. The federal government will not replace a house unless one is destroyed. And so we can't get ahead like that. And I gave the example about the aircraft because that actually has happened for the Air Force that we don't want.
Sure.
Yes, and we said, oh no, yes you do.
I wrote about it.
Yeah.
So I know. I guess, you know, this will be a non-editorial comment, but I'm really pleased that Wells Fargo and organizations like NAACP are trying to sort of think through the edges of this. But the problem is so voluminous.
Yes.
You know, if you go almost to any city, and I'm sure in Missouri there are some, but I've spent a lot of time recently in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and you sort of look not at your classic homelessness problem in which there may be other public health issues related, but families, essentially, working families who somehow are managing jobs and kids and living on the street or moving from facility to facility to facility, and it just doesn't seem to be on the radar screen of many folks. And I guess the question is, when I see that, I look, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's beginning to look at partnerships, but when you have working families that are failing to be able to have a roof over their head, that's got to kind of call out for at least some different form of approach. And maybe it's part federal, maybe part local, part state, but what gives you, I guess I shouldn't say what gives you hope, but what should the partnerships look like to begin addressing that kind of problem?
Well, I think the private sector must do what it can, and then the federal government must do what they can't. And if you mix that together, and I agree, Wells Fargo is actually taking some significant steps in helping. But when that comes together, I think we're going to have success. But there are constant drawbacks because when the American Rescue Act was approved, 1 in every 5 renters in the country were in arrears on paying their rent, and it was worse for homeowners in the United States. And so, usually after these crises hit, non-brown black people are able to recover. It puts us further and further and further behind. And when President Biden, if I hadn't supported President Biden before, I certainly would have supported him afterward. After I had a meeting with him in the White House, it was either his first meeting or one of the first meetings he had. And I was invited with a number of Republicans and Democrats from the Senate, and we talked about housing. And that's why I got so excited about the Build Back Better. Forget all the Republican, Democratic, vegetarian opposition. It's just, but think about, the fact that I sat with the president in the Oval Office as he said, I am as excited about housing as you are, to me. And so I got, excited about the possibility that we had planned to be able to do $150 billion in trying to get housing at least at a minimum level around the country. We weren't able to get that done, so we're back now fighting to try to figure out other ways to do it. For example, I think we're trying to reform Community Reinvestment Act, which financial institutions, banks, they have an assessment and they try to get their credit for it. We're trying to do that, to redesign it so that there is the opportunity for a significant number of dollars in CRA to go to affordable housing. I also think that we maybe can increase the community development block grant program each year. It is the most flexible program of the federal government in any department, so we can use more dollars for housing. And then municipalities. I was mayor of Kansas City for 8 years. I know when you're talking about providing housing, affordable housing, you got to deal with zoning. You got to deal with people who. I got $1 million for a group of people. This happened since I've been in Congress. I have staff here who know the whole story. $1 million for them to tear down a building so they could to do affordable housing, and the city council voted, not in Kansas City, Missouri, but in another town.
Right outside Kansas City?
Yes.
Really close to Kansas City?
Yes. Yeah. They voted no, they didn't want the $1 million.
Wow.
Because they didn't want to do affordable housing.
Not in our backyard.
Well, because they also interpreted affordability with housing to, I think, race. And so.
Right. So here's the question, and I know we're getting close to the end time, but I just want to be honest about this. If you all go over, and if you haven't gone over to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, there's a section in there about redlining. I think it's redlining, not redlining. It's a really powerful area. My former colleague, when I was at the Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates, probably wrote one of the most comprehensive pieces on this. And so, to a certain degree, you had, Look, I'm getting at the age that everything seems pretty recent. But you know, when you kind of go back and you sort of look what this country grew through, in which people alive today saw essentially a large financial crime against a community, and you're a mayor of Kansas City, is there, I sort of find it interesting that there's not awareness, and I've talked to Mark Morial of Urban League about this a lot, that there's not an awareness of the costs that were imposed on particularly the black and brown communities in this country of getting ahead, and that others didn't have that. So you have different asset bases to begin with, and you have these areas so I'm just wondering, when you're in Congress and this history is there, it's in the Smithsonian, you've laid it out in the Atlantic and other places, is there not amongst your colleagues an understanding that more needs to be done in these areas, not less?
No.
Why is that?
I think, let me preface my answer by saying, I think God has been trying to help the United States become a great nation. So the question has been, and still is, will we cooperate? And I think there are signs that we don't cooperate. Look, here's something I really need to say. We had the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. We are now almost at that level, the level of housing we had in 1968, minorities. And so, you can look at the Fair Housing Act, the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and look at the decline and how we've been really running hard backward as it relates to housing.
Right.
And so I think we can win this thing. I think there are some things that can do. If the Wells Fargo, for example, if other institutions, and there are some others, who will step up to the plate and say, look, we want to work with the federal government.
Yeah.
And I used some of the earmark money. We're not supposed to call it earmark. All of the good money, whatever.
Specifically targeted,
yeah.
explained funds.
Yeah.
Okay.
I used my earmark money to help start a housing project near the historic 18th and Vine Jazz District.
Right.
And so a banking entity stepped up and said, okay, we're going to put our money into this project. So now we got public-private money.
Right.
And we're standing on the edge now of building 300, or creating 300. Some will be rehabbed. But that kind of thing, will work. But the federal, remember, I make the decision to spend the money that from the earmark.
Sure.
Congress did not.
I see.
And that's what we really need to do, is focus on members of Congress, doing acting out their beliefs. But this is the painful, ugly thing I have to say.
Yeah.
There is no punishment for not doing it.
Right. Well, I want to thank, before I do that, I just want to thank again with regards to what NAACP, but there are a lot of programs out there that are trying to build financial literacy, do things, I would call them kind of concierge services to help people in this area, which I find so important. But we could talk for another hour, and your team is going to get really upset with me. But this whole book thing that you're doing, American Coup, tell us about that for 30 seconds.
I started writing on
This is a novel.
Yeah, I started writing it on the train from Washington to New York.
Well, you would have had 2 extra hours this morning.
Yeah, I thought about that when you told me about the lateness, and it started getting good to me. And so I continued, and I looked up and I had a pile of stuff, and I was naming characters after members of Congress. I was on the train, and I looked over, and there's Chase Hotel. We're going to Wilmington on the train.
Wow.
You can see the Chase Hotel. So I stole the name Chase and put it with one of my closest friends, Alcee Hastings. So it became, the President of the United States became Chase Hastings. And then, believe it or not, and I know it's hard for people to understand, I wrote this before all of the Trump stuff. I started writing on it, and I was doing an interview about it, and people, guys said, "This is based on Donald Trump." And no, I didn't. It wasn't. Donald Trump had not reached novel level when I started this, and so.
Well, I'm going to go read it. I haven't read it yet, but once I do read it, then we're going to have to do a book event. Is that a deal?
That's a deal.
All right, my friend. Great. Emanuel Cleaver, Congressman from Missouri, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Our next panel of guests is going to discuss the current and future landscapes of the housing and rental markets. Please welcome Diane Yantel, President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, Yannicka Ratcliffe, Vice President of the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute, and Danielle Hale, Chief Economist for Realtor.com. They are all joined in conversation once again by the Hill's Steve Clemens.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to pin myself. I'm going down to the far end. How are you?
Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning. Wasn't that powerful conversation with the congressman?
Oh, yeah.
I do.
Okay, great.
I do.
Okay. I mean, I'll always have time to talk about it.
We're hearing somebody else's, folks, we're hearing somebody else out there. Great, thank you. And I also want to tell my team, and this is, this is intimate enough that I hope we can get some questions from all of you. I'm letting my team, I don't have any timing up here, so we would love to have that, so thank you. Let me just start out and first of all say thank you so much for joining us this morning. And as we think about what's happening in the market, we see inflation rates that are sky high, not coming down very quickly, and housing stock is a key part of that. And it's so substantial that when people I've talked to in the financial sector, with some of what your colleagues in this area are telling me, it's going to be a very, very long slog to sort of, you just can't you just can't disappear that escalation in prices. And I'd just be interested, Diane, as you sort of look at that challenge from not just home purchases, but home rental, just existing in American housing market for someone who's out making an okay middle-class living. What's happening and how do we help them?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here for this important conversation. And I think the key point to know there is that the lowest income renters and people who are experiencing homelessness are suffering the most in today's housing market. Even before the pandemic, we had about 10 million of the lowest income renter households who are paying at least half of their very limited incomes towards rent each month, and many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their very limited incomes just to keep a roof over their heads. And when you have such limited income to begin with, and you pay so much of it for your home, you are always one financial shock away from missing rent, facing eviction, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. So for many of these same households, the pandemic was that financial shock. They lost jobs, they lost hours at work, they lost wages. It was harder than ever for them to cobble together what they needed to make rent. Congress responded, really federal governments at all levels responded in unprecedented ways with protections and resources to keep tenants stably housed. Now those protections have expired. Those resources are all but depleted.
So can I ask you real quick about, because one of the critiques was that a lot of those funds weren't used. What was happening in that case of the rental assistance that went unused in some states?
Oh, at this point, the vast majority of those funds have been spent or obligated. Yeah, it got off to a slow start because we had 500 new programs being stood up early in a pandemic. That takes time and focus and designing programs to ensure that they're meeting the needs of the lowest income and the most marginalized people takes time and effort in design. But at this point, those resources are nearly depleted. So those renters who struggled before the pandemic are even worse off now as costs are rising, rents are skyrocketing, and homelessness is increasing.
So you may not like this, but I'm now following you on Twitter.
Great.
And you had this really shocking tweet, and you say, as rents skyrocket, remember a $100 increase in median rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness.
That's right. And
and we've had a higher than $100 increase in median. Yeah, so go into that unpack
And that's
that
the,
for
that's
me.
the GAO.
Right.
That's their study where
Right.
they found exactly $100 in monthly median rent increase results in a 9% increase in homelessness in that same community. And last year, rents increased by almost $200 per month, about $179, which is far more than we've seen rents increase in many, many years.
Right.
So again, those lowest income people are struggling. Many of them are falling into homelessness. Sometimes it's the homelessness that we see. It's visible homelessness. It's increased encampments. It's more people going to homeless shelters. Sometimes it's the invisible homeless. I thought the tweet you were going to mention was the one that I did yesterday, where I got this heartbreaking email from a mom and her disabled son that are living in a storage unit because their landlord raised rent higher than they can afford and they were evicted.
Yeah, I've seen that around the country. It's heartbreaking. I mean, it's just part of the real scene, and that we're trying to be very realistic today as we talk about. So, Yannicka, you know, the Urban Institute where you're at, it's one of my favorite places. You are the, you know, sort of the Wizard of Oz of data. You know everything going on, but I think broadly, when you sort of look at the fairly bleak picture of what's happening right now, and I'm interested as you're thinking about programs to activate to give genuine assistance at scale to those who need it. And that's one of the things I'm always interested in. I hear a lot of boutique programs of folks helping some folks in, you know, towns or cities. I'm just looking for the scalable answer. So tell me what you think can be done out there to begin constructively addressing this need.
Well, first of all, thank you. I don't have all the answers myself, but I try to.
But you do have the data, right?
That's right. And I appreciate being here as well. And I really appreciate what Diane put in front of us as really the critical crisis still facing low-income renters. We are, as we have heard all morning long, some 3 to 5 million units short in housing. Units of all types, set aside whether they're renters or homeowners. It's across, up and down the housing spectrum, except for maybe.
I mean, and I just want to interrupt you. When we talk about low-income renters, they have income, right? The low-income renters,
Sure.
and they are renting and they're working, right? We have remarkably low unemployment in this country. So I just want to put that on the table, that we're talking about people who are engaged in this economy in our society that still can't get a roof over their heads.
That's right. That's right. But the supply shortage has been hitting all up and down the chain. I think the people who have weathered the recent crisis the best are the current homeowners. In some ways, home ownership represents a kind of affordable housing. People think of it as being high end, but it really provides stable, fixed rate housing costs for the long term, especially when rates are low.
Right.
So given that we're so many units short, that because of the underbuilding that's been going on since 2008, we are seeing rents go up, as we've just heard, incredibly high. We've seen house prices go up by 36% since the beginning of the pandemic.
Right.
So all of this is trapping more and more households in the rental space, right? We're really, whether we're talking about becoming a homeowner or maintaining your rent, we're still talking about the renters in this country. The homeowners have done pretty well. They've been
Right.
able to take low interest rates, fix
Well, the
their...
homeowners did well if they could survive the big Great Recession.
Well, the Great Recession, but most recently the homeowners did extremely well because of the foreclosure moratorium,
Right.
which proved to be such a successful strategy. Lessons learned from 2008 foreclosure crisis we touched on earlier, just making it simple for homeowners to take advantage of the foreclosure moratorium and to take advantage of forbearance, and then to get back on their feet once those moratorium have expired. And foreclosure starts are lower now than they were at the
Right.
beginning of the pandemic. So homeowners, big winners, and we really do feel, while we're on that subject, that the lessons learned from that forbearance ought to be part of the permanent solution for keeping people in their homes. So on one end of the spectrum, giving more people at the top end of the renter market more access to homeownership is affordable housing solution, because that does fix the payments, and it is kind of a macro policy. And so homeowners are sitting pretty right now with their low payments. Renters are seeing their rents continue to go up. In a survey, most landlords expected to raise rents in the next 12 months, so it is not going to get any easier for current renters today. So, there's no single
So are
silver
there
bullet.
programs out there that you think are laudable, that are really useful in terms of giving a financial step up to those in that squeeze?
The renters are in a squeeze all up and down the spectrum,
Yeah.
and I think we all would have ideas about different segments and what can help them, everything from improved Section 8 voucher programs and making sure they're more accepted, ways to help with sustained renter counseling, ways to continue the income supports for renters that proved effective during the pandemic.
Right.
In the step up from renting to home ownership for those households that are ready, we've already heard a lot today, but I want to emphasize the importance of down payment assistance, especially for households who have not had the benefit of the intergenerational wealth. We heard about how a few generations ago, households of color were largely excluded from the big housing boom that really became the foundation for middle-class white wealth in this country,
Right.
and which give parents the opportunity to help their kids do things like buy a home. The median wealth of the parents of a white young adult today is over $200,000. The median wealth of the parents of a young black adult is less than $20,000. So it's clearly not enough to help your kids buy a home and still have something left over to fall back on. So helping households who have not had access to that intergenerational wealth through down payment assistance and low down payment loans is one key, and we can talk about some more details. But that
Danielle at Realtor.com, you're the chief economist there, and it's great to talk to you. So I assume you also see many of the trends that are going on out there. And I suppose if I were in industry, on one part of it is it looks very good for people in that industry if you're if you've got an asset. If you don't have an asset in this market, what do? You don't
have a home as an asset.
Yeah.
It's challenging. It's challenging for renters in the market today because they are facing those increases.
Right.
Landlords are, even if they're not moving, landlords are increasing rent, and the majority of renter households report that their housing costs are the biggest source of financial strain. So it is a real issue, even for those who are staying put. For homeowners, if you have that asset, you're in a pretty good position right now, unless you're trying to move, and then you're also facing high costs in the market. But at least if you've owned your home for a period of time, you're sitting on likely a record high level of equity. In aggregate, the U.S. homeowners are sitting on a record high level of equity, so they're in a better position. But housing costs, whether you're moving and trying to buy or moving and trying to rent, are just up across the spectrum because we haven't built enough homes. A lot of people have estimates. Our estimate is that we were 5.8 million homes short at the start of 2022, and that number has likely worsened over the course of the year, even though builders are building close to the upper end of their recent range. We just saw new construction data out today, and it actually increased a little bit this morning. So, there's some bright news, but builders are facing a challenging market because as financial conditions shift, short-term buyer demand has really evaporated. It's hard for households to make mortgage payments today when they're 66% higher than they were 1 year ago for just the median house. That's because of home price increases and also because of interest rates going up. So it's a lot harder for households in the market today to make those numbers pencil out. And because of that, they're pulling back, and so builders are pulling back, even though we do have this long-term shortage situation. If you look at vacancy rates, homeowner vacancy rates are at record lows, and rental vacancy rates are not far behind. They're just a little bit above record lows, well under 6%. So when there's scarcity, which is what we're seeing in the housing market, the way the market balances that is by pushing up prices.
Let me ask you, in the world of home building or in that construction area, is it more lucrative for these large companies that build homes to build for the upper end of the market, as opposed to mixed use or affordable housing projects? When I talked with Mayor Bowser about this, she said that the packages that have to be put together, tax incentives, all this, are somehow very, very complex and very large to try to address this affordable housing crisis that we've had in Washington, D.C. And she took me on a tour once showing me lots of affordable housing that we built here. But the need is ever greater. And I guess I never really had an understanding of the complexity of that. So it raised the obvious question of, if I were a builder, why would I do that? And as you look across the country, are the incentives and packages and models robust enough to actually get the attention and resources there? Or do folks in the building industry just walk away and say, we don't want to do that, we just want to build for rich people?
So I don't work with builders, so I don't have a concrete answer. But based on what we see in the data, it is harder for them to build at those more affordable price points because we're not seeing that construction happen. And that's something that we've seen consistently over the years. So it is an ongoing challenge, and we haven't figured out a way to address that collectively as the private sector and with the public sector's help as well.
Is anybody here from Delaware? Any Delawareans? Anybody driven through Middletown, Delaware? Yeah, you have? Yeah, so I'm mentioning it because I'd love to have the mayor here. It's one of the it's like a boom town, right? I mean, I've lived on the Eastern Shore, had a house on the Eastern Shore for a long time, and Middletown, Delaware, which is near the Maryland border, you take, I guess, I forget what it is. It's 301 or something, and you're kind of going across the way, and this, all of these stores and giant box stores, everything have come up. But it has become a huge town, and I've seen lots of affordable housing go up. So the workers are working there. I have friends that are now, working there. And I'd love to just find out someday how that happened, because you do see not necessarily there's like the big Amazon thing out there and all of this other stuff, but you saw a plan come together, which I've been watching over the last decade, of essentially greater and greater investment in certain kinds of businesses, lots of services, but then the only thing that could support it was low-income housing for all the workers that would have to staff this. Now they've done it. Now, I don't know if it's a good thing I've seen. To me, it looks like a lot of sprawl, but I've seen tons of affordable housing units out there. So are there models out there that we ought to be looking to that are positive, as opposed to much of the picture that we're talking about today, which is pretty bleak?
Sure, there's effective programs that can help make homes affordable to low and extremely low income people, but they're underfunded compared to the need. And it's important to understand at the National Income Housing Coalition, we focus on extremely low income households, people who are at 30% or below area.
Are those mainly urban?
No, it's urban, suburban, rural, and there is a shortage of homes affordable and available to them everywhere. The difference is from most severe to least severe in terms of the shortage of homes for the lowest income people. And for those extremely low income households, and I'm talking about seniors or people with disabilities who have extremely limited fixed incomes, SSI or SSDI, or families where the parents are working very low wage jobs, sometimes multiple low wage jobs, and can't afford the rent. So for those extremely low income households, the private market on its own cannot build and operate homes that are affordable to them, because the rent that those households can pay doesn't cover the costs.
So shouldn't the government step in there?
Yeah, exactly. That is a market failure that requires a government intervention in the form of subsidies.
And where do we do that?
Well, the federal government has a number of very effective programs to build affordable apartments: the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, the National Housing Trust Fund, rental subsidies to. In some places, we need to build more apartments. There are literally not enough apartments, and they're not affordable to lowest income people. So we need to build apartments at all levels, but we need to build some, ensure that they are affordable to those lowest income people through construction subsidy programs like LIHTC and the National Housing Trust Fund. In some places for the lowest income people, there are enough apartments, but the people living in them can't afford them. So there needs to be a bridge between what they earn and what rent costs. And we do that in the form of rental assistance. Housing choice vouchers is our country's most successful program to end and prevent homelessness through housing choice vouchers. Altogether, in our country, only 1 in every 4 households that needs housing assistance and is eligible for it receives any. So 75% of households are eligible, they need housing assistance, they don't get any. It's just 25% that win what's essentially a housing lottery system in our country. So until the federal government steps up and is willing to fund these successful programs at the scale necessary, these housing challenges for the lowest income people will persist.
Before I take a couple of questions to the audience, let me ask Yannicka and Danielle this question. I may be wrong, I'm usually wrong in predicting the economy, but I think a crisis is coming. And I think it's a crisis of some sort which will be very painful for working Americans again, because we see a Federal Reserve that seems quite committed to raising interest rates to a level. Larry Summers is basically saying we will not have done what we need to do as far as central bankers until we essentially see a doubling of the current unemployment rate, which is pretty staggering. So if that is right, and I sort of think that Chairman Powell's comments recently are pointing in that kind of direction, then there's going to be a financial reshuffling in this country at some level. So if we were to anticipate a crisis and look at this problem being exacerbated, so then there's something for policymakers to react to, what would you say we need to actually immediately do in a time of crisis to rewire this so that we can make a substantial investment in correcting some parts of this problem? Jannica?
So I'm going to let Danielle, the economist, predict the future of the economy.
Well, you have to presume this is going to happen.
Well,
We're going to have nastiness.
It's happened a few times lately, so
Right.
I think we can get comfortable with this idea.
Right.
And every time it happens, there's a reshuffling. We see the people who have the least, especially households
Right.
of color, taking the biggest hit. And frankly, as we've been talking about the sort of winners and losers from the recent pandemic, home-owning households,
Right.
majority of white households, really fared on the main pretty well from the equity increase and the ability to reduce their payments. Whereas renters, again, the majority of households of color are renters.
Right.
They have been taking it really hard. So every time around, we heard earlier today about how the 2008 crisis and the predatory lending really stripped wealth from communities of color, much more so than white households. So every time there's a crisis, unless we keep an eye on this continuing equity gap, how is it that we haven't gotten any closer to closing the racial homeownership gap since discrimination was made illegal in
Right.
housing? So we need to just keep our eye on that ball and stay focused on it for a change, and actually exercise the will to keep our eye on that problem and make sure that each new successive crisis doesn't continue to exacerbate the gap we have.
Danielle, I know that this is putting you in an awkward spot before we go to the audience, but I am interested in this question of how do you use a crisis for good, and if we're going that direction, and you see yet again, because my view of this after talking to Emanuel Cleaver is that the U.S. Congress, the federal level, has figured, despite these problems, that they are largely absorbable and ignorable. And I'm glad we're doing this program today because I disagree with that. But if we do have much more pressure and stress and the squeeze, as we were just discussing, hitting these families, is there not something that should be thought of and done in advance that might try to rewire this, maybe around some of these programs, and pre-position the response as opposed to just reacting to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question. How do you build the will when you face a crisis? What's, I think, interesting about the pandemic is that it was very different than the previous financial crisis.
Right.
And that's because there was no finger pointing. There was no, you're in this situation because of your own bad choices. There was a collective understanding that we faced a problem and we needed to do something about it. And so I think in a way that can serve as a good example for what we should try to achieve, which is to work together to focus on the solutions. Now, as far as how we specifically address these big problems, I mean, we need to build more housing. That's very, very clear. I don't know the best way for the federal government to actually make that happen, but we do need to build more housing across the income spectrum. That is certainly clear, and in areas across the country to make sure that it's available.
We have time for a couple of minutes for questions. We've got one right back here, yes. And we're going to bring you the microphone. And we're recording this, so tell us who you are and where you're from.
Okay, yes, thank you, good morning.
Or you can use another name that's not yours. No one's going to, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, my name's Jake, I'm from HUD, and I just have a question about one of the themes that is reoccurring throughout this conversation from multiple folks. One thing I'm interested in is, the different local areas that may have prohibitive laws or regulations that make development harder.
Right.
And I was wondering if we've seen, regional effects here, if it's worse in some areas or metropolitan hubs worse than others, and, what possible solutions might be to make those more accessible for development.
That's great. Can I ask you just one quick question? At HUD, because you have a direct line-on view of the programs that you're supporting out there, do you feel they are robust and getting wider, or do you think they're under pressure and getting narrower?
Well, I am 3 months in, so.
Okay. So everything looks robust and new. Okay, great. Thank you. That's a great answer. Thoughts, Danielle?
So yes, it does matter where you are. It does matter the policies that the local government has. Builders are better able to build in some areas because there aren't as restrictive zoning policies. That said, once you have zoning policies in place, it can be very difficult to change. I live in a Virginia suburb that's very progressive, and I can't tell you the number of yard signs where people are fighting upzoning in this very progressive, relatively urban area. So it is really, it's nice to think about. We know that is a needed solution, but it's a lot harder when it hits close to home. So I think to the extent we can incentivize local governments for making those difficult choices, because they will be difficult choices, because people don't like change, even if it's going to come gradually. And so I think to the extent that we can, first raising awareness, and then having incentives for local governments to undertake those tough choices.
Diane, Yannicka, do you see regional characteristics?
Yes, and I would just say, I think, of course, the biggest incentive for local governments to do better is federal funding,
Right.
and whether or not they get it.
Right.
And for a long time, the conversation has been around HUD dollars and maybe restricting the allocation of those funds based on whether states and localities are doing more to reduce restrictive zoning, and that's certainly a good start, but it's those much larger pots of funding, the infrastructure dollars, the highway dollars, that communities won't turn down. They need those funds, where we should really be looking to either incentivize or require changes at the local level. And the Biden administration has been making some progress there with some of the funds that have come through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, where they are judging proposals for those funds and scoring communities that are doing more on restrictive zoning higher to be able to receive those funds sooner. That's a really important step.
Yannicka, quick thoughts?
I agree with everything that's been said, and I think those large overarching points are the critical takeaways. I can mention some specific segments where better changes to regulatory local reform coupled with financing tools, which might actually be more of a federal, but for example, manufactured housing has been, just like every other form of housing, well depressed in the number of shipments that we're doing annually for the past 15 years or so compared to what they used to be. It's come a long way. It's more environmentally sustainable as well. A key kind of niche piece of the affordable housing supply puzzle, especially in certain markets. And there, again, zoning requirements as well as challenges that would-be buyers face in getting financing, safe quality financing to afford those homes. Could be two sides of the coin. Condominiums are another one that faces sort of regulatory hurdles on the one hand and financing challenges for would-be owners on the other. ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are coming online as a key piece. We estimate they could add as over 200,000 units a year for both rental and potentially home ownership, but largely low-income rental. Again, that relies on local zoning and permitting flexibilities, as well as on providing current homeowners the kind of financing that they can use to build those units. So those are some specific examples of how various pieces can be enhanced.
Great, thank you. We got one last question here.
Thank you. Leon Peace from here in Washington, D.C. My concern is, I guess, one of the, an often ignored underside of the housing crisis is homelessness and poverty.
Right.
And what I want to ask is, what initiatives do you see or foresee as being effective in reducing homelessness? For example, the tiny homes projects in the California area. Do you see any more viable options to deal with that increasing problem?
Thank you very much. And I've interviewed the tiny homes folks. I sort of saw it as a different track today, but at one level for veterans, that was one of the veteran strategies for homeless veterans, particularly in California, San Diego area. But would love to hear your thoughts when we start with you, Yannicka, on poverty and homelessness.
Well, it all comes back at the end of the day right now to the critical problem on the table. There's not enough supply of houses that people can afford at almost every level of income and housing needs. So anything that can add affordable units is going to alleviate some of that pressure. We do need to make sure that all this new affordable construction is actually geared to and accessible to the people who need it the most.
Yeah. Diane, quick
answer. Just very quickly, that homelessness at its root is a lack of access to affordable and accessible housing. So we need to build more homes and make them affordable to the lowest income people. That's going to take some time. So in the meantime, we need far more robust and permanent tenant protections that keep people in the homes that they're in. One thing that people don't realize when we talk about homelessness is that communities are ending homelessness every day on the individual level. In the city of LA, where homelessness is maybe best known and most visible, On any given day, they are moving about 200 people from homelessness into stable housing. On that same day, about 225 people fall into homelessness. So as much as we are working to move people off the streets, out of shelters, into affordable housing, we also have to prevent the incoming, the wave of new homelessness that's right on the horizon. And that comes through all of the programs that we talked about today, and protections against egregious rent hikes, against unjust or unreasonable evictions, and so on.
Danielle, final word.
Yeah, I think the one thing we definitely agree on, we need to build more housing across the income spectrum, and the sooner we do that, the better.
What I would just say to the gentleman here is that on whether it's tiny homes and whatnot, which I once said, is this a fad or is this really dealing with something? And I have to tell you, I still have mixed views on that, but it was very clear on veterans. It was a very interesting way in which veteran homelessness was approached. But I'll tell you one last kind of bank shot on this as a policy issue, which for those of you who are very interested, I'm really interested in how the LEED certification organization that works with buildings, and you get these LEED certification for sort of certain platinum or post-platinum or kryptonite, whatever it may be, but they're increasingly applying this to communities and looking at what are the dimensions of health and getting LEED certification for community development. And as part of that, I think affordable housing and integration, diversity, inclusion, local coffee shops, all of this, various forms of transport are part of that. But next time we do this, we should bring the folks that do that, because I think that's another way when you can get communities competing with one another, that they're putting a priority on addressing this issue as part of their gold star rating. Then you can probably see how you might get some competitive forces going that might begin to deal with this much more, and resources and priorities put in there. But let me thank Diane Yantel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Yannicka Ratcliffe, the Vice President of the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute. You should check out the Urban Institute. Danielle Hale, Chief Economist at Realtor.com. Thank you very much for today, really. And Jason, you want to say a few words as we close?
Very few words. On behalf of the Hill and our sponsor, Wells Fargo, we'd like to thank all of you who joined us here today and those who tuned in on the live stream. If you missed any portion of today's discussion, all of the conversations will be posted on thehill.com as well as our The Hill Events YouTube channel. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.